The Tripartite Pact was signed in 1940 between Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan. The alliance between the three countries allowed for each one of them to make more aggressive military actions in their respective regions. The United States had been aiding the British with supplies and weaponry to help in its war effort against the Nazis, but had not yet committed any air or ground forces in Europe.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Japan attacked the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, based on a separate conflict between the two countries. A few days later, based on the Tripartite Pact with Japan, Adolf Hitler officially declared war on the United States. Along with the ensuing battle in the Pacific against Japan, the U.S. entered the European theater to help defeat the Nazi and fascist regimes and to liberate the many nations overthrown by Hitler. The first U.S. troops arrived in the British Isles in January 1942, but nearly a year passed before they went into action against the Axis powers. Meanwhile, air power provided virtually the only means for the Allies to strike at Germany. The Royal Air Force began its air offensive against Germany in May 1942, and in July, the first American crews participated in air raids against German convoys. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill suggested Anglo-American landings in North Africa, where the British were fighting the combined forces from Italy and Germany. The Nazis were led by German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. U.S. General George Marshall ordered General Dwight D. Eisenhower, then in England, to take command of the invasion. Army troops were hurriedly trained in amphibious warfare. Technicians modified commercial vessels to service landing ships. While Eisenhower monitored operations from Gibraltar, American forces landed along the Atlantic coast of French Morocco, near Casablanca. When American infantry entered the desert conflict, the British were battling Nazi and Italian forces for control of Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. In a conflict which lasted for 12 months, British Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery, along with Eisenhower and U.S. Major General George S. Patton, squeezed Axis forces into the northeastern tip of the country. May 13, 1943, Nazi and Italian forces surrendered. The Allies captured over 275,000 prisoners of war. It was the beginning of American involvement in the war. By early 1944, the Allied strategic bombing campaign so reduced German strength in fighters and trained pilots that the Allies effectively established complete air superiority over Western Europe. Allied bombers now turned to systematic disruption of the transportation system in France in order to impede the enemy's ability to respond to the invasion. At the same time, American and British leaders orchestrated a tremendous buildup in the British Isles, transporting 1.6 million men and their equipment to England. The final plans for ground assault called for the Allies to land at Normandy and to seize the port of Cherbourg. They would establish an expanded lodgment area extending as far east as the Seine River. They would then advance into Germany on a broad front. The British Second Army would land on the left, while the American First Army, under Lieutenant Colonel Omar M. Bradley, landed on the right. An elaborate deception plan convinced the Germans that the Normandy landings were a fake, and that larger, more important landings would take place farther east, around the Pas de Calais. The Germans held most of their reserves there. They also kept their armored formations near Paris. Developments on the Eastern Front also caused some problems for the Nazis' ability to defend against an Allied invasion. In early 1943, the Russians destroyed the German army at Stalingrad. The Germans tried to regain the initiative in the summer of 1943, attacking the Russian city of Kursk. In the largest tank battle known to history, the Nazis suffered a resounding defeat. From that point forward, They remained on the defensive, in constant retreat. By March 1944, Soviet forces had re-entered Polish territory. This prevented the Germans from transferring additional troops to France. June 1944. Eisenhower took advantage of a break in stormy weather to order the invasion of Fortress Europe. The next day, just before dawn, 1 British and 2 U.S. airborne divisions dropped behind the beaches. After sunrise, British, Canadian, and U.S. troops began to move ashore. This was D-Day. June 5:30 a.m. The fog over the coast of Normandy had an unusual shape.
Suddenly we recognized that there were dark shadows over the horizon. These shadows were parallel to the coastline, so that we saw only ships to the left and to the right as far as the eye could see. We understood. They're here.
D-Day, the day of decision, had begun. The airplanes of the Allies destroyed even the last airports of the Germans. Under the clouds of night, airborne troops were landing in North France. Kamikaze commandos. And then, hell came from the sea. 213 warship cannons were firing on the German lines.
The earth was trembling. I got down and ducked my head. Sometimes, if for a few seconds the cannons were silent, I looked up to see what was going on, how far away they were. And then I did what others did as well for sure. I prayed, out loud.
The strange attack on the Normandy coast was ignored in staff headquarters. Jodl, who was responsible for strategy, decided not to wake Hitler up. Erwin Rommel, who was now responsible for the Atlantic coast, was celebrating his wife's birthday at home.
There was a staff meeting, 7:30 a.m. My father's chief of staff, Marshal Dr. Spiedel, called us and said that according to the latest information, airborne troops had landed. But if this was the invasion, I didn't know.
They knew that the day of invasion would come, but were not sure where. On the coast of the Channel or around the Calais. Rommel was supposed to stop the invaders.
My father ordered retreat already in El Alamein, despite Hitler's orders to win or die. My father was assigned to Normandy in France to protect the coastlines because he had experience with the English. The good morale of our troops was encouraged by the new tools and weapons. We could calmly look forward to the forthcoming events. We absolutely didn't have to think that things would come to a good or bad end. I was sure that everything would be all right, and I didn't think that the English would come back anymore.
2 years before that, a commando action of the Allies had failed at Dieppe. A fatal failure. And a test. Spring of 1944. Complicated maneuvers were being organized in England to fool the enemy with weapons which were not what they seemed. The real target was to keep Normandy a secret. In the ports of South England, the world's largest army was preparing. 3.5 million soldiers had to free Europe from Hitler's terror. Eisenhower ordered full victory, nothing else.
I think it showed the world that we was going to take Europe back. Once that landing was successful, we knew we were going to take Europe back. It may have taken the lives of many men,
The enemy did not suspect what was to come. For days, German intelligence listened to news that was supposed to keep the Wehrmacht busy.
Die Alliierten haben durch einen entsprechenden Funkverkehr.
The Allies gave a false impression that they were collecting further armies in Great Britain, which would attack later.
Zusammengezogen wäre, die eine weitere Landung durchführen könnte.
And the weather turned bad as well. Rommel left. The administrator's diary entry, 5th of June. Direct attack improbable. The surprise worked out. The Allies attacked in storm and low tide. The continuous rattling of guns lasted at least an hour, but something awaited the soldiers.
And the minute he dropped that ramp, machine gun bullets were in that boat with us. And the company commander went off first, and he was hit and killed. My sergeant was next off, he was hit. The medic went off next, he was hit and fell over in the water. And I was fourth, and as I started to go off, the boat come up, you know, the waves taking it up and all. I kind of hung my heel, and I went off side of the ramp, which helped me, I'm sure.
It was impossible to withdraw. There was no way out. The American Marines got Omaha Beach, the most murderous sector.
It was about 400 yards of flat sand, and I've been telling you, I don't know how anyone got across that beach.
When we saw that after the first few rounds of shooting, a lot of them didn't even get to the coast, we started to hope that we could hold them back and they wouldn't succeed.
On Omaha Beach, the undertaking seemed to turn to failure. On this one coast, the Americans lost 2,000 soldiers. How could the Atlantic Dike be captured?
They had all these bunkers up there in concrete, underground, and they were shooting out of these slits, and there was no way to get them. If you dropped a shell on them, it wasn't going to kill them. You had to get behind them.
They used every means. They aimed at the loopholes. I got hit as well through one of them. They shot through my hand. Later, Americans said that it was $1 million shot.
For these soldiers, war came to a better end. Hitler's empire was about to fall.
My father realized it pretty soon that they would lose. They only had to decide if they would keep on fighting in France. My father always said he would fight until the Russians conquered Berlin, or fight a free way for the Allies till Germany.
Den Westalliierten den Weg nach Deutschland freimachen.
The Allies struggled on. The desperate attempt to roll the Allies back to the sea did not succeed. A bridgehead in France. The Second Western Front was born. D-Day, the beginning of the end. The Death Factory, Auschwitz-Birkenau. The biggest human elimination factory of all times. As the commander of the camp called it, 1.5 million people were killed here. The initiator was Hitler. There was not even any attempt to hide his mad ideas.
If the international Jewish conspiracy once again embroils us in war, the result will not be the triumph of the Jews, but the extermination of the Jewish race in Europe.
The goal was the extermination of all Jews in Europe. He triggered the war himself, which became the tool for the realization of his threat. the messengers of genocide, the Black Guard of the SS.
Our family had always been based on helpfulness and humanity, and we had to face these men dressed in black who behaved as wild animals full of hatred. It was very shocking.
Beyond the Eastern Front, murder commandos chased men, women, and children to death. They killed more than 1 million people. The capacity of murders had been reached. The bureaucrats of elimination solved the problem. Men like Himmler and Heinrich. The slaughter had to be developed more effectively. A disinfectant promised a new solution. It was called Zyklon B.
Why does the world contain Jews, bacteria, and pestilence? I don't know. The Jews must be exterminated. This is our sacred belief.
(1942). Hitler suspected he would lose the war for the Eastern Territory. But the bigger his loss, the more he wanted to make his insane dream come true. His dream of genocide. At Hitler's order, the industrialized slaughter began. Belzec, Klimnau, Sobibor, Majdanek, and Treblinka. The 5 first deportation lagers. The central slaughterhouse, Auschwitz-Birkenau. The symbol of the Holocaust. The lords of the world, bordered by a barbed wire fence, were death's main troops of the SS. Hundreds of men who executed and monitored the daily genocide. In Auschwitz, they killed according to plan. Structured, efficient, precise.
Soon they stopped looking people in the eye, except, of course, when they had a personal relation. The prisoner was something totally different. He couldn't be a normal human being. He belonged to a different category of people.
From the railway station straight to the death factory. The smooth operation was ensured by a well-conceived system to mislead.
The whole family was together, all children, younger and older, we were all together. We didn't know where they were taking us. Somewhere to work. Probably to work, and they assured a kindergarten for children. That's what we thought. Nobody knew about Auschwitz.
The train to death was incredibly punctual. 30th of January, Berlin to Auschwitz. 2,000 passengers. Even costs were determined. 4 Pfennig for each passenger and kilometer without a ticket. Departure for the final solution. Hitler never saw the location of his lethal plan. On some days, 10,000 people would arrive.
It was 2 o'clock in the morning. We got out of the wagons, and we heard, but we were separated so fast. Men to the right, parents and the children. 1 minute, and we were standing separated.
Selection meant gas or work to death. In SS factories like IG Paints. The SS calculated the working value of prisoners. Predicted lifetime, 9 months. Income, 6 marks per day. Deduction for food and accommodations, 60 Pfennig per day. 1,631 imperial marks of profit after each prisoner. Others were taken here after the selection. They told the people to take their clothes off and urged them to remember the number of their hangar so that they could find their things later.
People were clean and laughing. They asked where they were, and We had to keep silent. We couldn't tell them what was going to happen to them.
The disguise worked until the last moment.
When the last one was finished in the shower, they closed the doors on them, and 2 SS soldiers threw the Cyclone B inside, through the window above.
Requirement: 5 kilograms for 1 lethal injection. 1,500 people.
Shortly afterwards, we heard the screams. It lasted a few minutes, 10 or 15.
The gold teeth of the dead were removed. Their shoes collected. Their toys, their watches, their jewels, their glasses. Slippers were made from their hair. Their bodies were burnt. Nothing was left of them. January 1945, the Red Army invaded the West. The gas chamber was blown up long ago, but the traces could not be covered. 27th of January, 1945, the day of liberation. Only 7,000 people had survived. The traces of the crime are still visible. Auschwitz-Birkenau, the fall of the 20th century.
Werden in diesen Kampf hineingehen, wie in einen Gottesdienst. Und wenn sie ihre Gewehre schultern und ihre Panzerfahrzeuge besteigen, dann haben sie nur ihre erschlagenen Kinder und geschändete Frauen vor Augen, und ein Schrei der Rache wird aus ihren Kehlen emporsteigen, vor dem der Feind erblassen wird. So wie der Führer die Krisen der Vergangenheit bewältigt hat, so wird er diese bewältigen. Ich bin fest davon überzeugt. Noch vorgestern sagte er mir, ich glaube so fest daran, dass wir diese Krise bewältigen werden. Und ich glaube so fest daran, dass wenn wir unsere neuen Offensivarmeen hineinwerfen, dass wir den Feind schlagen und zurückjagen werden. Und ich glaube so fest, dass wir eines Tages den Sieg an unserer Fahnen heften werden, wie ich je in meinem Leben an etwas fest geglaubt habe.
Spring 1945. The scales of war were now balanced against Hitler. The Germans met a devastating defeat in Russia at the Battle of Kursk. The German and Italian armies in North Africa were destroyed. The British, the Americans, and the Russians were closing in on Germany, and the Russians were within 100 miles of Berlin. Hitler now knew that the Nazis would probably lose the war. American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt died on April 12th, which fueled Hitler's secret desire to negotiate a ceasefire. But his true desire was either Germany would be a world power or would not be at all. The Führer embarked on a final murder campaign against the Jews and other subhuman people. Millions of people were sent to Himmler's mass extermination camps, which were now established all over Nazi-controlled Europe. He also ordered the complete destruction of all German industrial infrastructure before it could fall into Allied hands. Such an action would render the entire country unable to function after the war ended. This order was ignored. April 20th, Adolf Hitler's birthday. The Russian army arrived first. Soviet artillery from the First Belarusian Front began to shell the center of Berlin. And the next day, the Soviet army had Berlin surrounded. Hitler had retreated to a fortified shelter below the Reichstag, along with an entourage including his longtime lover, Eva Braun, and propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. As the city became a war zone, Goebbels urged the people of Berlin to engage in the fight themselves. All over the city, every able-bodied male was pressed into the desperate final struggle. Anyone fleeing or refusing to go to the front lines was shot or hanged on the spot by SS executioners roaming the streets hunting for deserters. In his last public appearance, just days before his death, Hitler ventured out of the bunker into the Chancery Garden to decorate 12-year-old Hitler Jugend members with iron crosses for their heroism in the defense of Berlin. The extraordinary event was captured on film as a tottering, senile-looking Führer is seen congratulating teenagers who were staring at him with worshipful admiration. They were then sent back out into the streets to continue the hopeless fight. Berlin's fate was sealed. Hitler knew it. April 29th. The Red Army launched an attack on the Reichstag. For the Soviets, the Reichstag was a symbol of the Third Reich and one which they wanted to capture before the May Day parade in Moscow. The German entrenchments in front of the Reichstag were defended by 88mm guns at the Berlin Zoo Flak Tower, manned by teenage boys and girls of the Hitler Jugend. They prevented a successful daylight assault. But Hitler was told of the impending truth. The Reichstag would not be able to hold for more than 2 days. Shortly after midnight, Hitler and Eva Braun were married in a small civil ceremony in the bunker. Afterwards, he dictated his last will and testament. The next day, Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini, Hitler's mentor and ally, and partner in crime, had been assassinated. His body beaten, spat on, stoned, and hung upside down in public. Hitler refused to perish this way. Meanwhile, Russian troops battled Waffen-SS soldiers only blocks away from the Reichstag, reducing Berlin to rubble, just as Hitler had done to countless cities throughout Europe. Cyanide pills were tested on Hitler's dog, Blondie. They worked. Eva Braun took one of the cyanide capsules and died. Hitler shot himself. Their bodies were taken to the garden behind the Reichstag, doused with gasoline, and set on fire. Their remains would never be positively identified. Joseph Goebbels issued a letter to Soviet General Tchaikovsky reporting Hitler's suicide and requesting a ceasefire. The Soviets would only accept surrender. Goebbels knew that he could never hide forever. The Allies would discover the atrocities, the crimes against humanity. That evening, he arranged to have his 6 children killed by morphine and cyanide. And then he and his wife committed suicide, the same way as Hitler and Eva Braun. The only difference was these bodies were identified later. World War II had ended. Hitler and the Nazis had failed. The Third Reich had begun 12 years prior to Hitler's suicide. It would survive Hitler less than a week. the sixth year of World War II, the final year. The Germans, having once pounded most of Europe, were now in retreat. Desperate to somehow win the war, they turned to civilians and the youth. With the Waffen-SS and regular army now depleted of officers, everyone, both young and old, would be thrown into the final fight to stop the onslaught of the Bolshevik hordes from the east and the Anglo-American gangsters from the west. October 18, 1944, anticipating the invasion of the German fatherland, the Volkssturm, or People's Army, was formed under the overall command of Heinrich Himmler. Every available man between 16 and 60 was conscripted into this new army and trained to use the Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon. Hitler Jugend boys as young as 15 were to be trained as replacements and sent to the Russian front. Objections to using even younger boys were bypassed. In rural areas of Germany, Hitler Jugend boys practiced guerrilla warfare against invading U.S. troops. In the forests, the boys would stay hidden until the tanks passed, waiting for the foot soldiers. They would then spring up, shoot at them, throw grenades, inflicting heavy casualties, then would disappear back into the forest. The Americans retaliated with air attacks and leveled several villages in the surrounding areas. If the boys happened to get cornered by American patrols, they often battled until the last boy was killed, rather than surrender. And the boys kept getting younger. American troops reported capturing armed 8-year-olds at Aachen and knocking out artillery units operated entirely by boys aged 12 and under. In a desperate attempt to continue the war through guerrilla warfare, Joseph Goebbels created the werewolves. It would rely on German youth that had been reared in the Nazi doctrine. These young guerrilla fighters, some younger than 12, would hold down and strike at the Allies behind the lines. Escaped concentration camp inmates were hunted and killed. Allied soldiers were sniped at. Wire was strung across roads in order to decapitate passing soldiers. Electricity in occupied towns was frequently disrupted. The werewolf program was ultimately a failure due to the lack of weaponry and coordination, but not because of lack of will on the part of the Hitler Jugend. Many of its most fanatical members were regrouping toward Berlin for the final battle. As Hitler Youth boys fought until the bitter end, their leaders were cowards. After Hitler's suicide, Hitler Youth leader Arthur Oxmann, who had been commanding a Hitler Youth battalion in Berlin, abandoned his boys and fled to the Alps. Baldur von Schirach also abandoned a group of boys in Vienna. With the war finally over, many young Germans had to come to terms with the horrors they had unleashed onto the world. Many would take years to admit that the man they had admired the most had wronged them. Some would never admit that they had been wronged or had done wrong. But some, like the former BDM turned SS guard Irma Gresa, never showed any remorse for their murderous deeds. They were all held accountable for their war crimes, put on trial, and executed by the Allies.
Ich habe zunächst mit 13 meiner Kameraden unter dem Befehl unseres Bandführers am Stadtrand von Hindenburg West gelegen. Diesen sollten wir gegen einbrechende feindliche Panzer sichern. Als diese dann aus der Richtung Gleiwitz am 24. Januar anrollten, teilte der Bandführer uns in 2 Gruppen ein und während er mit der einen gegen die Panzer vorrückte, um diese selbst anzugreifen, gaben wir anderen ihm den Feuerschutz. Unser Bandführer hat 3 Panzer abgeschossen und ist dann leider bei der Vernichtung des 4. gefallen. Nachdem wir seinen Tod festgestellt hatten, mussten wir uns aus taktischen Gründen auf einen Eisenbahndamm zurückziehen. Und dort habe ich dann am Abend die unter diesem hindurchführende Straße von Gleiwitz nach Hindenburg, die den Zug zur Stadt bildete, gesprengt.
Als der Russe näher an Lauban heranrückte, habe ich mich dem Kampfkommandanten von Lauban freiwillig als Melder zur Verfügung gestellt. Meine Aufgabe bestand darin, Meldungen zu den einzelnen Kompaniegefechtsständen zu bringen. Außerdem habe ich oftmals Panzerfäuste und Verpflegung in die Hauptkampflinie geschafft. Die Panzerfäuste habe ich auf Leiterwagen oder kaum unter feindlichem Beschuss in die Haarteile geschafft.
As Hitler once said, he alone who owns the youth gains the future. Fueled by manipulation, lies, and hatred, Adolf Hitler and the Nazis almost achieved world domination. Hitler wished to be remembered as a savior of the German people, but history will remember him as the most evil figure of modern times. Berlin. The war was over. Finally, the guns were silent. An almost unreal silence. But in front of the ruins of the Reichstag, on the 2nd of March, a new attack was being prepared. This time, only for Russian propaganda. What they had neglected to film 2 days prior, they now tried to compensate for, with artificial and ambiguous scenes.
The Soviet flag, the flag of triumph, waves on the Reichstag. We obey Stalin's order.
A photographer was on the roof as well.
Everybody was talking about the Reichstag, so I also fought myself through the crowd. There was an unbelievable chaos in front of the building. I had brought a red flag from Moscow. There I grabbed a few soldiers and convinced them to climb up to the top of the building. They were happy to come when they caught sight of my flag.
So the photograph called Icon of Victory was born. And the happenings made this old man a national hero. It was Milutin Kantaria who hoisted the first red flag after the siege of the Reichstag.
This is the flag we flew over Berlin. My commander in Berlin in 1945, Colonel Shimshenko, called me and one of my comrades and gave us the order, "Here's the flag, take it and fly it on the Reichstag." We repeated the order, took the flag and left to carry out the task.
It wasn't as simple as it seemed, and it certainly wasn't really a triumph at all. The reality of the fight for Berlin didn't include too many heroic myths. The Soviet army fought street by street until they conquered the capital of the empire, the city protected by Berliners until their last breaths. Even children participated in the fight. The storm of destruction returned to its origins. Under the battlefield, protected by strong concrete bunkers, the man who had caused the whole war was running away as a coward. He knew that he had been defeated.
We sat there, the Goebbels children and I. All at once, there was a shot. It was about 3 o'clock. I don't remember exactly. Anyway, it was a loud shot, and I still remember as Helmut said, that was a direct hit. Then we could hear the impact of the bombs as well. And I thought, you're right, that was a direct hit. Presumably, this was the hit which killed Hitler.
Der Hitlers Leben beendet hat.
Aus dem Führerhauptquartier wird gemeldet, dass unser Führer Adolf Hitler
My staff headquarters that our leader, Adolf Hitler, this morning in the Imperial Chancellery, in the fight he fought till his last breath for Germany against the Bolshevism, has been killed.
Deutschland gefallen ist.
With the death of Hitler, the already weakened empire collapsed. Thousands of soldiers were taken prisoner. Everything was moving in slow motion.
One morning, everything was so quiet. You know, one could hear silence after the war, after the noise of the war. I asked my mother if she had heard it. She answered, I think it's peace.
White flags where Nazi flags had flown before. On the 2nd of May, Berlin's protectors capitulated. Red Army soldiers had been waiting for this day for ages. Now they were the lords in the enemy's capital. The war, which had cost their country more than 20 million deaths, was over. In the hours of triumph, there was the tendency to make gracious gestures.
The whole picture of the Soviets as inferior Bolshevists suddenly collapsed at that moment when an older Russian soldier gave me his mess tin full of meat soup. We were hungry. We had not eaten for days. This was so unbelievable. A world had collapsed around me. This simply didn't fit into the picture.
Goebbels' propaganda had not predicted this.
Nobody wanted to believe it, but in the first week of May 1945, the Russians were very popular. But this later changed because of their behavior.
The liberators had become invaders, with all the negative consequences.
Diese Russen, die sind über uns hergefallen, haben einem das Zeug vom Leib gerissen.
The Russians assaulted us, tore our clothes off. We simply had to bear it. We couldn't protect ourselves. They hit my parents brutally with their guns.
Meine Mutter haben sie grün und blau geschlagen mit Pistolen.
The winners' terror, considering the inhumanity of the war, was maybe understandable.
Eine Besatzungsarmee, das ist kein Vergnügen.
An invading army is not amusing. It has always meant a strain for the population. After this war, which caused so much destruction in Russia, the Russian soldiers arriving to Germany were certainly not friends of the German people.
Als sie nach Deutschland kamen, keine Freunde des deutschen Volkes.
The hour of defeat. Many people realized, only after the capitulation, the terrible sins others had committed in their names.
I have to feel shame for being German. Besides the many horrible effects of war, the most bitter was that we Germans were responsible for such terrible things, and we could cause such damage. This hurts very much.
Pain, bitterness, despair, and hope.
I didn't want to deal with this anymore. I only wanted one thing. When the war was over, I was 22. Until that time, I had seen a lot of terrible things. From that time, I only wanted to live.
After the deaths of millions, there was no time for tears. Nuremberg, imperial party conferences, the city of ethnic laws, totally destroyed by the war. And now, here was the victor's administration of justice. Justice against the leaders of Hitler's empire. They had to account for their acts, for war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against mankind. This was the first time in history when the world passed judgment together. And this was the first time when a government was sued, and the number one accused was Hermann Göring.
He was a very clever man, very resourceful, and very adept in stating things his way. Altogether, a real personality.
A tested self-realizer, number 2 after Hitler, collector of offices and positions, imperial master of the hunt, prime minister in Prussia, head of the Luftwaffe, and imperial marshal. The game was over, but even after his arrest, he didn't want to accept this fact.
when he was captured by the American troops, he was allowed to talk to the press, and there was a big lot of publicity. And it gave him the idea that he had a certain status, that he was no ordinary prisoner of war, and certainly not a potential war criminal.
There were 32 accused, including Goering. Almost none of them showed regret or pleaded guilty. They were just carrying out orders or did not know about anything.
How on earth could those men conquer the world? They're the saddest bunch of people I've ever seen. Ribbentrop looked like a wet pussycat. Goering was putting on a show, and he was impressive to watch because he had nothing to lose. He knew he would be killed, and Hess was clearly insane.
The number one in Hitler's party did not remember anything. The man without a memory, the reporters tended to call him. And what was with the other party comrades?
The Hess war ein bisschen.
Hess was always a bit crazy, a bit of a daydreamer. Everybody knew that. The party is Hitler. Hitler, in turn, is Germany. Hitler is victory.
Among Hitler's supporters, Hess was the most reliable one. He enthusiastically supported the ethnic craziness, but with the main attack on England, Hess definitely wanted to mediate, like a tyrant. The qualified pilot flew over the channel and landed in captivity. Nobody took Hitler's assistant's intentions for mediating seriously. This fact did not lighten the circumstances for the Nuremberg court.
The evidence against Hess was in black and white on paper. Orders and decrees he'd signed and meetings he'd attended. The documentary evidence was very clear.
The culprits were taken to the courtroom, but they still denied their acts. Pictures of their enormity, the concentration camps, the government's death camps.
Defendants in the dock, when the lights came up after the film, had tears in their eyes. I think they were tears of shame, probably, and possibly, as you say, remorse.
Only one person confessed his acts, Albert Speer.
So many of the accused tried to certify, almost in an aggressive way, that they had nothing to do with the whole thing. Speer did just the opposite.
Speer was not only Hitler's architect, but his efficient armament advisor as well. He affirmed that if Hitler had had a friend at all, he surely would have chosen him, Albert Speer.
Every time he arrived, Hitler was delighted, as if his lover had come. They usually started to draw, to make plans, to build models. It was a pleasure to see them. They were as thick as thieves.
The fruits of common insanity. The world capital, Germany. Speer was to construct it on the ruins of Berlin. Germany was to eclipse the shine of Paris. But later, Hitler's architect would only be producing guns for the war. What did Speer know about crimes while he was looking for recreation? Later, he said he had nothing to do with these. He was going to be sentenced because of killing people with forced work. He suppressed his actual crime.
Seine ärgste und traurigste Schuld empfand immer noch. Seine billige.
He kept his highest crime a secret, the affirmation of the murder of hundreds of thousands of Jews. If he had professed this in Nuremberg, he would have been hanged.
He was not going to be hanged. The death penalty was given to someone else, Hermann Göring, and other accused. Speer was sentenced to 20 years in prison, while Hess was imprisoned for life.
Looking backwards, it does seem perhaps too severe.
In some cases, the verdict was too mild. In others, it was too strict. The entire general staff of the government was sentenced to death. But the number one accused did not face up to his judgment. Göring wanted to die like Hannibal, so he poisoned himself.
Göring told me, he said, look, when the time really comes for you to hang me, I'll be dead. And he fulfilled that. When we were all in the gymnasium with the scaffolds all set up, ready for number one, Göring was the first guy going to be hung. Went to his grave, he was dead.
Nuremberg's dead. Their debts were not abolished. Their bodies cremated. Their ashes were scattered into the river Isar. But their crimes will last forever. They celebrated the end of the war and the end of Adolf Hitler. Harry Truman and Joseph Stalin met in Potsdam. London and Berlin would rebuild. But the surviving Jews of Europe faced another battle. When the gates of the concentration camps were opened at the end of the war, the world saw the extent of the crimes committed against the Jews. There were approximately 6 million victims of the Holocaust. Only 100,000 survived. The Nazis were gone, but anti-Semitism was not. Many Jews fled to the Promised Land. Refugees from all over Europe sought their way illegally to Palestine on old freight ships, always in the danger of being discovered by the British and sent back. The Exodus. With 4,500 people on board, the steamer docked in the harbor of Haifa. It was a wreck, having been attacked by the British. There were dead and injured. The refugees kissed the ground of Palestine, though they entered as prisoners. The fate of the Exodus and its passengers moved the whole world.
It was unjustified. You know, there's in a war there are rules. You attack a passenger ship, but we didn't have any guns. We never carried guns. This I never could forget.
The exhausted people had only a few moments before they were loaded onto prisoner ships and sent back to Europe. Locked in trains once again, their odyssey ended in a former camp for German prisoners of war. Only later were they allowed to return to Palestine.
They can never be forgiven for what they did. You don't act this way. There's no human justification.
The United Nations would decide on Palestine. Would the Jews receive their longed-for homeland? The UN would vote on November 29, 1947.
We will start it now. Afghanistan, no. Argentina.
3 minutes, which would decide the fates of two peoples. The UN plan encompassed the division of Palestine, one nation for the Jews and one for the Arabs. Jewish leaders tried to influence the vote until the end, especially Ben-Gurion. The result was clear. With 33 yes and 13 no, Palestine was to be divided, and a new land would be established for the Jews. Joy for those whom had longed for their own country.
The people were dancing in the streets. Ben-Gurion felt alone and concerned. He told me, you see, today they're dancing. Tomorrow they'll have to fight.
The Arabs were outraged. On the same day, terror began in the Jewish quarter. The forces of the British Mandate looked on helplessly. In May 1948, the Union Jack was lowered, and the British left the country. Ben-Gurion jumped at the chance and proclaimed the State of Israel.
Thus do I establish the State of Israel.
Eretz Yisrael, the land of our fathers, was once again the homeland for the Jews. But for the Arabs in Palestine, Ben-Gurion's message was like a declaration of war. One day after the establishment, bombers attacked Tel Aviv. 15 Arab countries entered an alliance against Israel. Once again, it was a matter of life and death for the Jews.
We couldn't have a defeat after the Holocaust. So we were determined, we weren't guessing. And we know that everybody will do whatever he can to win the war.
The heaviest fighting was in Jerusalem, the holy city for both Arabs and Jews. A quarter of the Jewish population was surrounded by the Arabs and was fighting for survival. In the end, the new state was victorious, defeating its neighbors. Now it was another people seeking refuge, the Palestinians.
The place from which my family fled is now the site of the Knesset, the Holiday Inn Hotel, the university, and a shopping center.
Cheering in Jerusalem, the young country had won its first battle. The new homeland would provide protection from another Holocaust, as a new struggle began.